Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game. We
Woo.
are here on Friday, finally. Always nice to be a Friday where we get to record this. And today we are coming to another game from back in 2012 that did pretty well, I think, back then. Maybe it's talked about less now, I would say. But in my opinion, I think it was quite groundbreaking. And that game is Coup.
Oh, you probably couldn't hear me. Cool.
So Coup is this small box game, generally called a filler game, because it can be played pretty quickly. For 2 to 6 players, plays in the box says 15 minutes, which is doable. Depends on who you play with, because it is kind of along the lines of a social deduction game, right? So depends on your group on how well how quickly they play those kind of games. But box is 15. My experience, if you're playing with around like 5 people, maybe like 30 minutes.
Also depends on if it's
Friends.
their first times playing too. Once
Yeah.
people get used to the game, it does go a lot faster.
And so Coup, I'll start off by saying I think Coup was pretty groundbreaking. I use this for a lot of the games we talk about because that's the part that makes them stick out to me. Especially a game like Coup, which I learned about, I think through Kickstarter when I was first getting into games, board games. And the main thing about Coup that's different, right, is it's not just like a social deduction game where you're given a role, you have to pretend to be that role, figure out other people out, have your team win. One, it's a free for all, right? And the other thing is you're not given a role to play as necessarily, as in John's picture there, and in the picture of these cards here. Oops, upside down. So there are like 5 different characters in the game. And so the deck is not actually this thick. I think this is actually maybe 2 decks together that I have.
You ready for
Uh,
the expansion?
but like the game itself is actually what, 15 cards? There's 5
Yeah,
rolls and
three,
3 of each.
three, three of each of these rolls.
Yeah,
Like,
so only 15 cards for the game. And then like coins, the simple currency in the game. And so the reason why it's different is you're not necessarily given a role to bluff as or play as the whole game, but you're given these roles, 2 of them, and it's kind of like, I think thematically it's supposed to be like your influence on the council of the new world order. And so you don't show what these roles are. And then basically each role has a certain power, a different way to get money, look at other roles that are still in the deck, like the ambassador, get money like the Duke, steal money like the Captain, or try to assassinate someone as assassin, or block assassinations as the Contessa. There you go. Those are all the rules. Uh, and so I don't know. What's just so cool about this for me was every time I had to teach it back then, which I taught it a lot when I first got it, was you deal out these cards and you say, okay, these cards have these abilities. So on your turn, you do one action. You have to do one action. And there's a good reference sheet for that too that tells you each character's actions and the neutral actions. All right, so the characters, neutral actions that everyone can do on their turn. But then the cool thing is that I keep delaying this, but the cool thing is that you can do any action you want, whether you have the role or not. And that's the bluffing part of the game, right? Like I could have 2 cards and both could be an assassin, and I could be like, I'm gonna do the steal action with the captain this turn. And you're bluffing that, but people, I mean, it's bluffing. Other players might not know, and so it's up to them whether to call your bluff and challenge you or not. And if you're caught bluffing, or if you actually do get assassinated, you lose one of your cards. And if you lose both cards, those are like your 2 lives, and then you're out of the game. So I think just that was like so cool to teach people. Just like, yeah, hey, here are the abilities of the cards, but you can do anything you want on your turn. Yeah, that was the main thing that really caught me with Coup.
And that's where it's kind of the revolutionary or like the groundbreaking aspect of the difference. So we've talked about a kind of a social deduction game already in Resistance in our previous episodes. go watch them. In the previous, typically in a social deduction game, a lot of the game is focused on figuring out what people's roles are typically, right? And that's kind of the entire game in the overall aspects of a social deduction. Once you figure out people's roles, it's kind of set, or it's kind of like, that's it. And then that's throughout the whole round or the whole play of that game. In this game, it's very interesting because as Ben was saying, is there's all of these different influences that you're given. So technically you're not these characters as mentioned before. These are the people that you're influencing in the world. And this is actually the same world as the Resistance world game.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing that we didn't mention. This is actually a crossover, or this is a continuation of that universe in this game. But the thing that we also didn't mention is you actually have two of these cards. You have two influences. It's not that you only have one, you actually have two different influences that are face down in front of you that you have kind of power over. And as we mentioned before, there's only a certain amount of each of these cards, and you're bluffing, right? The whole thing. So and that's the part that makes this as a social deduction game very unique, because in a lot of social deduction games, there is an element of bluffing in a lot of those, but it's typically as, you know, you're just trying to make people think you're a certain role or a very particular kind of role or team, usually is kind of the idea. But in this game, again, you can do anything that you want, and you can choose or claim to be any of these kind of roles or activities of the influence that you have. And so the part that's unique and special about this game is that ultimately you're basically trying to get the other players, your competitors, to lose that influence by the end of the game. Right? So basically you want to be the last person standing, and all of their influence is gone and you have influence left over. So as kind of mentioned before, there's a few different roles. So we were mentioning that there's an assassin. So ultimately the way that you kill off characters is either using an assassin's power, which is to assassinate another player using a certain amount of coins, or you collect enough coins through basic actions or through other character powers like these two to gain enough money to do what's called a coup, which is, you know, title of the game, action of the game. It's great. And so it takes a lot more coins to do that, but you immediately get to remove somebody's influence from the game. Basically, you force them to flip over. So that's kind of the way that that you make the game progress over time. And so because of that, there's pretty much every single one of these characters has a distinct action that they can do. So that's already 1, 2, 3, 4 actions, direct actions that you can take, in addition to there's 3 other basic actions that any player can take as well during their turn. And as we mentioned, there's only 1 action, but the fact that you can do 7 potentially different things within your turn is kind of the part that's really interesting. And the fact, because it's a bluffing game, what I found was the greatest part when I first played the game, once people kind of figured it out, you realize, oh, we had 5 people claiming the same exact power and nobody was saying anything because no one wanted to risk whether or not that was an accurate call. So that's the other part of this bluffing game is, if someone is bluffing or you believe that somebody is bluffing, rather than just letting them go ahead and do their action, you can basically call BS on their activity. And by doing that, the other player can either choose to not take the action at all, and they may have to pay certain costs. So like if they're trying to pay for an assassination and then you get called on it and they decide not to do the action, you still have to lose the coins that you paid. But that's it. It just stops the action for the turn and it moves to the next player. Or the person can choose to reveal one of their influences when they're called out. And if they do reveal their influence when they're called out, if they actually had that influence, the other player who called them out loses their influence, which is like, But if the person who called them out was successful and that player doesn't have that influence of the action he called, then that person loses their influence.
Yeah, so in those cases, like that's kind of the way that the game continues to move forward, right? That when someone takes an action, someone's gonna feel the effects of it, right? Because actually, I think with what you said, you're saying if someone calls your bluff when you're calling assassination and it stops it, it doesn't actually stop it, right?
Well, that's if you did have the assassin, right? So
No,
in the example of the assassin,
doesn't it only stop it if you actually block it, like claim to block it? But if someone calls your bluff, you either have to reveal and you're right, or you reveal and you're wrong, right?
So if you're so in the case that we're talking about right now, if let's say I'm fighting, like I have my secret influences and I'm like, I'm gonna assassinate Ben, right, with my assassin power. So I use my coins, and then Ben now has he has a few options. One, he can say, I'm gonna take the hit and lose an influence. Sad face for him. Ha ha ha, I win. The second thing he could do is actually call that he has the influence of a Contessa to say, I'm blocking your assassination attempt.
You activated my trap card.
Which then actually gives me, as the assassinating player, the opportunity to decide whether I call him on that bluff and say BS, that he doesn't have a Contessa, or I just say, okay, the block happened and my assassination attempt does not go through. Or third, that's the third option, Ben could say, when I do the assassination attack, he could say, I don't have an assassin, basically. He calls me out saying, I don't believe you have the assassination ability. So then I would flip one of my cards, and if I had the card assassin, not only does he lose an influence for failing calling me out, he also gets assassinated, which means he actually loses 2 influence on that turn. Superpower. Yeah. Or I flip over a card and show, haha, I didn't have an assassin, which means that the assassination doesn't happen because I didn't have the influence. And Ben is protected at that point.
So that's the kind of the tree, right, of how like one action will progress. And so when teaching it to people, that is the part I think that's trickiest to follow, right? Of like at this point, I called this action, then someone can call my bluff or not. But if they don't, goes on to the player I'm doing it to, and then they can either claim something or they could call my bluff. And if they claim something, then it comes back to me if I want to call their bluff or just let it go, you know? That's kind of
that's specifically for these 2.
Yeah, that's like the farthest it'll go, like 3 steps, right?
Yeah, and
but that is the trickier part for people to grasp, because you have one person potentially bluffing, encountering another person who's potentially bluffing, right?
Because everyone's bluffing in this game.
But then in the example we talked about, I think this kind of getting to the smaller details, I think that's why it's cool that not only are these 5 characters different, right? Like either stealing some money, getting a lot of money from the pool, looking at cards that are remaining in the deck so you have more knowledge of cards people could have, or actually trying to assassinate, which is cheaper than doing a coup. But then the interesting one, I think, was Contessa, which you said in your examples for blocking assassination, right? Like Contessa is the only one that doesn't have a direct action, right? Her only action is a reaction to an assassin's assassination. And when people first hear that, they're always like, who would ever want this card, right? You can't actively do something with it. But it's the very fact that an assassin is out there that it makes sense to have this card, because then not only does it let you block, it allows you to call someone's bluff or have someone call your bluff, right? And so I think that's a really smart, small detail of having this defensive character that fits in so well with the rest that feel more active, but she is just as important.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like sometimes it feels like, why doesn't she have an active? Like, wouldn't it be easy to add a really simple action? But as we said, this whole game is all about bluffing, right? And so it's almost this thing where sometimes the cards actually don't even matter in some respects of like what you actually have in front of you, because sometimes what it is more of the mind game that you're playing with somebody else about, I might not have the card, or I might have the card, right? And it's like, it's not even that you have a card or you don't have a card. It's even just the probability or the potential that you could even have that card or not. And that's where the game, I think when you first learn the game, it takes a bit, as we were saying, to learn, but it's relatively simple. I don't think it's that difficult or that hard to honestly pick up that quickly. And then once you really start kind of understanding how the game plays, that's when this game gets like super exciting, because that's when it's like,
those cases
what
like
is everyone doing, you know,
where you're like kind of paying attention to like counting the cards, right? Because as people get eliminated, their cards are face up. So then you see like, oh, they just lost an assassin, so there's only 2 more possibly out there, right? And then there's those funny cases. Like I was gonna say this earlier, I think the excitement in the game picks up pretty quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
From even the case you talked about where like 5 people claim to have Duke when there's only 3 Duke cards. Like in the first round, you're just suddenly like, hold on, someone, 2 people at least were lying, you know, at
At
least.
least 2,
Yeah. It
if
could
not
be
more,
all
because
5 people lying.
exactly, because one of the things we didn't mention is there's this stack of 15 cards that are in the play, and when you deal them out, you only deal out 2 to everybody. So there's only a maximum of a certain amount of cards that are going to be in play, currently in play, and all the rest of them are sitting in the deck. So especially if you play lower number or like lower player number games, there's higher probabilities that those cards are actually not in play at the time. So all 3, for example, if you're playing like a 3 or a 4 player game, all 3 Dukes could be sitting in the deck, but then 4 players are calling the Duke, and all 4 of them could be lying about it, right? For getting a lot of money, or like stealing money, or calling assassinations. Like there are situations in which that happens, where people there's sometimes nobody has these cards at all, and it's
or those times where like you have 2 copies of one card, and someone does it, and you're like, really, you have the 3rd one. Exactly. And obviously you wouldn't say it out loud, right? Because you don't want to give away what you actually have. And I think that's the part that is the other small part that's tricky when people are trying to learn the game, right? Is because I think in the beginning it's easy to accidentally give away what you have, right? Based on like if you're playing with people who are more experienced, they might have a better idea of like kind of like, oh, at this point, like maybe you should have called this person's bluff when he did that, you know? But then the fact that you didn't, the other players might be like, oh, like maybe just gave yourself away a little, you know? But that's a small thing. Like I think it's just like after a couple games, people get over the kind of difficulty of, or get a sense of how the bluffing works in the game, which is different again from those like those bigger group social deduction games, and even maybe more in line with like poker-ish kind of.
Yeah, because I was going to say one of the things that does throw off a lot of early or new players in this game is in most games when you're dealt a card or dealt particular cards that have identities and have actions associated with the cards, you kind of think in your head like that is my identity or that's who I am. And that's something that you actually want to break away from in this game as soon as you understand how the game plays. Because again, the whole point is you're trying to be as mysterious as possible as what you actually have. You need to be throwing people off because it means that no one can call you out if you're so, you know, if you can claim. It was really fun because there was one game I played when I was playing this game somewhat recently, probably in the last year or 2, where within 5 rounds at the beginning of the game, I claimed every single one of the roles at one point. And it was great because someone was like, wait a minute, you literally called out every single one. They were like, because I like started off saying I was a Duke and I was collecting a lot of money. And then someone tried to assassinate me. So then I said I had the Contessa. But then the following round, I was like, I'm stealing from this other player. And then everyone was like, wait a minute, can he steal? Because he's already claimed 2 cards. And then after that, I was like, I'm going to change cards in the deck with my ambassador power. And then people were like, what is going on? And it's so good. It feels great when you get that kind of play around of this movement of the activities.
Yeah, like once people get the game, and as you've been saying, yeah, it's true. It just takes a couple gameplays, right? A couple rounds, and then you can really get it. That's when I think the phrase I've heard before is like, then you learn to play the player, not the game, right? You got to learn to like bluff and play the other players into getting you on top, basically. And I think with that, it sounds like a really solid game. I think the one thing we've also talked about quite a bit over the years with Coup is there, for each of these 5 roles, there's kind of some seem better for different player counts, right? Like I think the main one that comes up is the ambassador that gets to look at and kind of randomly swap cards with the middle deck is more powerful when you're playing with more people, because the deck in the middle is then smaller. So when you get to look at that, you get, in a sense, more finite more definite or concrete information as to what's actually out there also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in that example, right, in a 6-player game, effectively what's happening is there's only 3 cards that are left over at the end because you're dealing up 12 cards. So there's only 3 in the deck. So if the ambassador gets to look at, because basically they get to draw 2 cards from the top of the deck, look at them in conjunction with the cards that you have as well, and you can exchange them. So you can basically keep whichever ones to the amount of influence that you still have, right? So if you have 2 influence, you're looking at 4 cards and you get to keep 2, and you put the rest back into the deck. So, but that means that really all you're seeing is all but 1 card is potentially in play, right? Because you have information now that there's 2 cards that aren't in play. So that means there's 2 of one of these roles that nobody else has because it's sitting in the deck, right? And then your own cards. So that means all of the other cards are somewhat in play, and there's 1 other card that you're not quite sure about. But the amount of information you have from that is huge. Versus if you only played like a 3-player game or a 4-player game, you're dealing out less cards in the deck. So there's a much bigger deck, and you have to shuffle the deck after you look anyway. So then there's chances you could draw the same card actually that you're looking at, right? And so
that's the main one I remember, kind of people being like, oh, ambassadors more powerful and higher player counts. For the other ones, I don't really remember.
Yeah, I would say ambassador is probably the most influenced one. It's also interesting because the ambassador is the one role that changes with some of the like the expansions that came out that add in an additional or a change role. So I think it even kind of speaks to this character in the sense that it is so varied in its power level based on the amount of players you have that they created a different alternative version versus all the rest of them always like stayed the same in their in like the update to the game or the expansion to the game.
And so yeah, in mentioning expansions, I will just kind of mention them really briefly right now because I do have a few of them. So one is Coup Brazilian Art Edition, which is really cool. I think the color scheme is really nice. It has like different kind of art. And it is a bigger box. I think this might have been like I kind of want to say a limited edition thing that Indie Boards and Cards, the publishers of Coup, had on Kickstarter. So I did get it back then when I was really into Coup. And then the other thing that's nice about it is they made the cards tarot card size. So it's just kind of more convenient if you like the kind of bigger card to deal, pass out. But I do find that people also do like just the small size of Coup, the original Coup. So this one, but then this version plays the same.
I was going to say,
no, go ahead.
I was just saying you could really carry this anywhere. Like you don't even need the box. You can literally carry a baggie, like a sandwich bag, and you could put the cards and all the coins in, and that's all you need. Right?
Yeah.
Like if you really wanted to.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend carrying a board game in a sandwich bag, but it's that size.
And so this version plays exactly the same though. I think it does add one of those roles that you can swap in or out called the Inquisitor for the ambassador that John was mentioning. Then there's the first expansion for the original Coup Reformation, which John and I was kind of talking with him a little bit about it before this just to refresh my memory on it because I think I barely played it. Again, it was maybe something I backed because I was into Coup at the time. And it's not, I would admittedly say it doesn't seem necessary. It adds, I think the main mechanic they tried to add is on top of the base game, you're also dealt kind of a faction card. So there's 2 factions throughout your gameplay and then there's ways to kind of swap factions with people and you basically want your faction to win. That kind of seemed to add a layer that just complicated it without making it that much better. And then the other thing is like I think this maybe came with the Inquisitor card for the original Coup. I don't know. That's my Kickstarter version that had it, but I'm guessing this might have it. You might want to check online, like Board Game Geek, to see the components if you're ever curious about getting this 4-year version of Coup. And then the last thing was it added. Do I have it here? Let me just take it out. It added gold coins.
Ooh.
Gold
Golden
coins
coin.
worth 2 versus the game's
Is
increments
it
of
2 or 5?
1. It's I think it's 5. That makes more sense. Yes, you're right. 5. But yeah, I think that's actually the only part of the game, the expansion that I actually use. I put the gold coins with my regular Coup coins. But so I don't think I would necessarily recommend the expansion unless you just really want to try something a little different with Coup. And then lastly, eventually there was this bigger box, medium box, I'd say, Coup Rebellion G54. That's the main title, Coup G54, which was a kind of remake brought into the kind of Resistance universe for the older version called just Coup G54. I think it was maybe called G1954, like during like a supposed to be some like war in Guatemala or something. I think that was the theme of the original. But this version, this medium box one, is so big because it goes off of the original formula of how Coups played, with basically 5 rolls, probably 3 cards of each, and then you kind of use those powers to, be the last one standing. But then it comes with, if you can see here, all of these
Potential
are
roll.
different rolls from the original. And so it looks like, I think there's like about 20 different rolls. And so you basically, each time you want to play it, you're kind of randomly choosing which 5 rolls you want to make into the deck for that gameplay. And so that was pretty interesting, how they could come up with so many different ones, where obviously there's some ones that are like basic, like getting money as the banker. But then there's definitely some ones that are interesting, more interesting than the original. So that's Coup Rebellion G54, which was a pretty cool, I think a more fitting way to play an advanced version of Coup, if that's actually what you're looking for, instead of the expansion.
Yeah, and if we think mechanically with the G54 Rebellion game, it had more that feel. It almost tied in some of that deck building that we talked about from Dominion into the variants of the game, right? Of not that you were playing a deck builder game, but more of the selection of these of the characters, right? So in the G54 expansion or standalone expansion, or I guess standalone game, there are certain ones that you do need to select, or you're expected to be selecting out of within each kind of pool of types of cards. In the same way that there's different types of cards here, there's kind of like these base 5 of like a defensive card, a money making card, a information gathering card of some way, a getting money, like actively taking things from other players card, and then a killing card, or like a damaging people's influence card. So it's still typically those cards play to those elements from what I remember. It has been a very long time since we last played G54, but it has that sense. So there are some recommended, and I believe they have some recommended like playthroughs of like what is considered balanced, at least from the developer standpoint, in case you wanted to just jump into something that has more variance than this game, which is always the same 5 rolls all the time, right?
So yeah, I think between those two, like those would be the ones to really get the feel of Coup from. And I would always start with the base version, because starting to play with other rolls and mix it, that can kind of make it a little more complicated to teach, or just another step to have to teach and have people get used to. But I would say, it is G54 is more solid than getting the expansion. And then it's more kind of just like, do you want a whole bunch of variety in how you play Coup, or do you want like small, simple, straightforward Coup that you can carry with you? And so lastly, I guess I will go to BGG, Board Game Geek, and look at my score that I gave it probably a long time ago. And so my score is a 7, which is its average score also. And I would say that is still fitting, because it is a filler game. like I mentioned in the beginning, it's something that can be played really quickly, and it's called a filler game because it kind of is what people can bring out to fill the time while you're maybe waiting for people to come still, and to kind of fill in that time building up to when you play kind of your bigger game for your game night. And so as a filler game, yeah, I don't usually give filler games like an 8, because as good as they are, they're not ones that I find like super deep, that I want to like, get into for the night. I definitely have played Coup for like a night. And like, I don't know, there's that one time at like Henry's house that a whole bunch of us were there and we kept switching in and out and played for like 8 hours or something. It was long, but people were like excited when they like switched in. I mean, not playing 8 hours straight. I think I would get tired of that by that time.
Yeah.
So I think 7 is solid. I mean, it's described as good, usually willing to play. Yeah, as a filler game, I would want to play it, but it is still a filler game. So I would give it a 7. Yeah, solid.
I think for me, I would probably say 7.5, mainly because to me, in terms of filler games also, kind of even thinking from that category, I do feel like Coup is one of the best of filler games that you can really easily just throw in, pick up, and drop off, right? And I do think that, as you were saying, like if you set up a party situation or you have a lot of people playing in a group or like a board game night or something, you can sustain people playing this game for a very long time. And I think that's one of the things I also like about this game is the fact that it is quick. As Ben was mentioning at the very early part of this, it can extend sometimes with the people you play with, but this game really isn't something you should be taking. I think we were talking about it in the Resistance, where Resistance says like a 30 to 45 minute game, if I remember the timing correctly, but our average gameplay, like typical gameplay when you play Resistance, runs like hour to 2 hours, potentially with the people you play with if they're very analytical or they play it like Mafia, where sometimes people get really into the discussions. Versus in Coup, it's like, I think the nice part about the game too is the fact that there is a basic action that lets you just pick up money over time slowly. Like you're just picking up a piece of gold, a piece of currency, and then once you get to enough, like you can force the game to move forward with the money that you have, right? So there is a way of making the game go. Versus sometimes in these other games, kind of have to wait for people to discuss. So I think for me, that's why I've found a lot of enjoyment with Coup. The other interesting thing, which I don't know if it's an official, like this is not a developer official balance or an official like growth or expansion of this game, but if you have, or the way I played it with people is if you have multiple copies of this game or you have multiple cards of these characters. So Ben had given me a Kickstarter version, which actually has 5 of these character cards. Because it came with different artwork for the base set, and then, or like it has the normal 3, which are all the same faces, and then they added 2 unique kind of artworks, even though they're the same card, it's just different artwork. So technically you have 5 cards. So we've opened up this game to actually add more than 6 players into a game of Coup. And then you just play with a lot more people at once. There are some balance issues with that. I would not say it's a perfectly balanced game, so do it as a house rule. It's up to you how you figure out what that stands for, how many people you can play with. I think
the rules
obviously you can't have more players than the amount of cards that there are in the game, but you should try to have at least where there's at least 1 card remaining. And if you're going to add like 1 extra roll, you add in, all of 1 extra roll of every single roll. You don't add like only 1 extra of this guy and 1 extra of this guy and none of the others, right?
Yeah,
you have to
keep
do
it even
equally.
But I think the rules in that Kickstarter version, right, did have up to like 10 players, right?
Something like that. So it's a pretty high number because you have the 5, right?
And actually, just a small thing to toot Coup's horn is I remember getting the Kickstarter version for myself, and then I was like looking for it as a gift for people, and I happened to come across like at a game shop they had some copies of Coup, and I would during that time I was like, whenever I saw Coup, I would like check the box because the Kickstarter version has this K. the regular version doesn't have. And so I would look for it, and when I found it on one just in the random game store, I'm like, what? You're selling Kickstarter versions? And I don't think the person knew, so I just like bought like 2 of them, and it was like maybe like kind of expensive still. Maybe it came out to like, I don't know, $20 for one or something. Where normally it's probably like 10, maybe $15
probably, yeah.
for the game. But then I remember then also looking up later on, like, you know, you can't just buy Kickstarter versions anywhere. And so I think on eBay or something, it was like Kickstarter versions selling for like $60 or something. And so I was like, oh, good thing I came across those. But yeah, now you probably can't find it. So
Yeah. Out of print. It's been how many years? 8 years now. So
yeah, 8 years now. So I give it a 7. John gives it a 7.5. If this sounded interesting to you, this kind of different take on bluffing filler game, free for all, small card game, definitely check it out. It's a really solid game, and it's surprising that there aren't more games that have been doing different things with bluffing. You know, I think Coup was a very standout at its time, and then there have been kind of more like one versus all kind of bluffing games, you know, like trying to either work together or maybe sabotage each other in kind of Mysterium kind of style, you know. So definitely not much stuff like
there's like that
Coos.
one. There's like Sheriff of Nottingham. That's a bluffing
Yeah,
style
yeah,
game. It's
yeah.
still kind of a 1v a little bit because each player, but that's a different game we could talk about another time. But that one also has variants. But yeah, in general, especially this kind of like BS style with the social deduction, I think is not typical.
Yeah, it's quite unique to Coup. So yeah, so if you guys found this helpful, hope you guys can check out the game. I think it actually is available in like Target, so something that made it to mainstream, easy to get, very cheap. Like I said, $10 to $15 maybe. Yeah, hope you can check it out, and hope you can let your friends know if you found this useful listening to our review of Coup. And until next time, see you then.
Peace.